So I had this story idea about this goblin realm where these goblins are clockmakers and they design clocks. That's their school of trade. They're very obsessed with timekeeping. And one particular goblin does not like clocks at all. He doesn't like clockmaking. He doesn't like anything about clocks. He doesn't like schedules. He doesn't like any of that. And so one day, well, not just one day, but every day, he would slack on making the clocks with his family, his goblin family, in their goblin realm. And his goblin family would always nag him, saying, "Why don't you make clocks? Stop slacking off." This goblin would do things like play video games in the goblin realm and smoke weed and just like sort of lay around on the goblin couch and just wouldn't make clocks. And they live in like this like cave-like place. It's like these vast caverns. And so they're like, we're not okay with you. We're not okay with you slacking off like this. You gotta keep time. You gotta keep time with us. And the goblin, he was like, "This clockmaking is shit. I hate clockmaking. This place is shit." And his goblin family was like, "Oh, so that's what you think of us. So that's what you think of us," they said. They said, "Well, if you really think that this is shit, we'll show you what shit is." And so they sent him off. Where did they send him? They sent him, of course, to the bowels of a human being in the plane of existence of humans to live there. This goblin was no bigger than a walnut, let's say. And so here this goblin was. He found himself pushed through a portal out of the goblin realm and directly shoved into the bowels, the deep intestines of a person, a human being from a human world. And so this goblin understood now the true meaning of shit. He now understood clockmaking was not shit. At first, he was in denial. And he said, "Well, they don't want me. They can not have me then. They'll be fine without me. I'm better off here anyways." So the goblin stayed inside the bowels, refusing to admit that he was wrong, refusing to admit that he had been given quite a swell existence, that making clocks wasn't actually so bad. And so his curse was that he could not leave. They said as he left out of the portal, "You cannot come back until you've learned how to make a clock out of the shit of the human being that you reside in." And so that was his ticket out, his only ticket. They said, either that, or you admit that we were right and you were wrong. And forever on after, you will make clocks with us until the end of your days. We'll help you get out of that shit. But you will help us till the end of your days. And so that was the deal. He could ask for help to get out, to leave this realm. They would portal him back. They had eyes and ears on him. They could tell what he was doing even when he was a whole dimension, a whole realm away. But see, goblins, they're very smug. They're very uptight about right, who's right and who's wrong. They're not easy to admit being wrong. That is very shameful for a goblin. They're all about being right. So that's one of the most degrading things a goblin can do, is admit that they were wrong. They are stubborn. And so for a long time, this little goblin was stubborn. This little goblin teenager rebel. This little teenager rebel goblin was stubborn. And he sat in the shit. And he made his own house out of shit. Inside the intestines of this human. And guess what? As much as he wanted to, well, for a while it was good. For a while he was happy. He said, this is way better than what they were having me do. I enjoy just sitting here in my sofa bed, my sofa shit bed. This is way better than making clocks. Way better. But after a while, this goblin, for he did not have any more weed. His weed ran out. He did not have a TV. He didn't know how to make electricity here. Well, he ran out of things to do. And so he just sat on his couch for a whole week. And then he realized that the only thing he had to eat was shit. And that didn't taste that good, even for a goblin. That did not taste good. No. But still, he persisted. And then he had an idea. Well, why don't I make a clock? Why don't I try to make a clock? And so he found his way around the intestines of this human. And he gathered various parts, various unprocessed foods and whatnot. And he started to build a little goblin man cave, so to speak, inside this human, inside the intestines of this human. He had already built a couch out of shit. And now he's building other things, like a nightstand and a bed. And he made a little room for himself. And eventually he was like, well, might as well try to make a clock. Might as well know what time it is. And, well, it was hard to make a clock at first because, well, he didn't pay a lot of attention about how the clocks were made. when he was with his family of clockmaker goblins because, well, like he said at the beginning, clockmaking is shit. So he kind of didn't really know how to do it. But he had spent so much time around his obsessive clockmaking family that he gleaned some things from all their yapping about clocks and their making of clocks. And yeah, he had made a few clocks in his lifetime, even though he didn't like it and he didn't do it much and he slacked. But he had made some, but he barely remembered how to do it. But he remembered just enough that he started to piece it together. But see, these mechanical parts, he didn't have these mechanical parts that are required to make a clock tick. All this processed food, it really was shit. And he couldn't make anything out of it. It was not good at being molded to become parts for a clock. But over a long period of time, well, he continued to try and try and try to make this clock. Took a long time. Took a very long time. And all this time that passed, he began to realize something. He began to realize that, well, all the things that he had been given in his original home with his family, well, he kind of missed those things. Not only that, he kind of missed his family a little bit too. And despite them being clockmakers, because that family, that was all he had actually. So his stone heart had begun to soften a little bit. And he was growing more and more tired of this intestinal world that he had been forced to live in. But you know what the goblin did? Well, he was a clever goblin. And eventually, he gave up on making the clock. He still didn't know how to do that. And he still had too much pride, too much stubbornness to ask for help from his family. And so what did he do? He shot out of this person, out of their sphincter, their buttock sphincter. Shot out, and he went down the drain all the way to the sewer. And there he met some rat goons. And he becomes so obsessed now of how to make a clock that he just had to make one. He tried and tried and failed and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed. That at this point, he had to make one. If he didn't make one, he was going to go insane. And so that, along a slew of other things, was why he finally shot out of this person's buttock sphincter into the drain. And so he became the Rat King. And he began to order the rats around, and he got them to give him parts. He sat on a kingly sofa in the sewer, and the rats brought him parts day by day. Eventually they brought him dials and pins and needles and cogs, and eventually he started to recognize all these parts. He said, "Hey, I remember these. These were the essential inner workings of the clocks my family made." And so little by little, he and his rat team began to forge the most ad hoc, yet magnificent clock the sewer had ever seen. And once years had passed, they finally finished. Generations of rats had lived and died. The story was known throughout the sewerdom. Once the Goblin King made this clock, then all the rats would be able to invade Clockworld, the world of goblins and clocks. This was the only way that the Rat King, the Goblin himself, could convince and coerce the rats into making this clock machine for him. He told them that there were pounds upon pounds of cheese locked away in this portal dimension, and only if they built a clock could they go in and raid the cheese bin in the goblin world. And so, finally, the day had come to test the clock. They wound it up. Made a horrible cranking sound, and then it cranked into place, and then finally, boop. It worked. And it was in time with the region of the world that it was in. For, of course, the little goblin teenage rebel, aka the Rat King, knew how anal the goblin clockmakers were about time regions and time zones. And so he accounted for this. And so the clock was set, and it began to tick. And the Rat King, teenage goblin rebel, waited. He said, "Any moment now, they'll open the portal, and we'll be able to go in." And did he go in? Did he not? Who knows? Who knows? Just kidding, I'll tell you the story. I'll tell you the ending. I won't leave you on a cliffhanger. So, begin to tick. And lo and behold, the portal opened. But guess what? All the goblins were prepared for. They knew about all the rats, for they could see their little goblin teenage rebel, and they could see his every move, his every thought even. And so they knew about his scheming to bring in the rats. But see, nothing about this would have worked, because they don't have cheese in Goblin World. It would have been a huge disappointment. You see, the Goblin Rebel teenager was merely jealous. He was jealous that all the others actually liked working on clocks, living their little goblin lives in their goblin world, making clocks. And so he was going to send the rats in to spite them. This was his final revenge plot. But it didn't work. For all the goblins on the other side of the portal were prepared for the rats, and they knew of his plan. And so they came out, guns a-blazing. Yeah! They had chainsaws. They had maces. They had scissor hands. They had rotating saws. They had all manner of hacking weapons, slashing, all these ad hoc DIY weapons, and they took the rats by storm, by surprise, and it was a great battle. And the Rat King fought at the head of the rat army with his 2 lieutenants on either side. They were in metal armor suits. They were difficult to kill. And it came down to the Rat King and his family. They were the last ones left. And so they both went head to head, and they all died. Except for one. The uncle Goblin Clockmaker. He survived. But everyone in the goblin race had died. And all the rats had died. So this Uncle Goblin, what did he do? The only thing he knew how. The portal had closed. no hope of getting back. So he set up shop. He found a little clock store. And it had been abandoned, but he brought it back up to speed. Put the open sign out front and started business in the human world, selling clocks. The end.